23 folks watching, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Ben Edgerly Walsh. I run the Climate and Energy Program for VPIRG, and obviously work very closely with many Town Energy Committee leaders and with Joey Miller, who you all know and love, and runs the network of Town Energy Committees. So it's a real pleasure, as always, to participate in the VECAN conference. And of course, as I'm sure all of you do, I really wish that I could have been there in person at Lake Maury, as I have so many years to see all of you and get a chance to have many, many conversations in the hallways of that event space. Unfortunately, we're virtual, as all conferences are right now, but I think we're really going to get a lot out of this conversation nonetheless. And I look forward to seeing you all in person next year. So let me just briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'll just sort of set the table, and then I'll let them take it away. I'll be asking them a few questions, just sort of get the conversation going, and then probably we'll have a couple of follow-ups. But as I mentioned a minute ago, if you have questions at any point, please just go ahead and drop them in the chat. I'll be monitoring that. Joey's going to be monitoring that as well. If there are ones that are sort of particularly timely, like clarifying questions, we'll do our best to get those answered in the moment. But mostly we're going to keep Q&A to the end of the panel. So if we haven't answered your question, it's not because we're not interested in it. It's just because we're trying to get through some sort of context that's going to get a lot of questions answered, and then we'll dive into more of the Q&A. Joey, are you raising your hand?
I am. I'm sorry to interrupt, but just like on a sort of logistical, we get to know Hopin. You can only see 9 on Hopin. You can only see 9 people at a time, but you can see that there's 28 people in the session. And if you click over to the session tab on your right-hand side, and you look at and you click to the people tab, you can see who the 27 people are in this session. At the top of my list is the fabulous Laurel Green from Rockingham. Hello, Laurel. Please stay muted, but it's great to see you there. But that will just give folks a sense for our presenters and everyone else who actually is in the session. Sorry for the logistical note, and thank you for letting me just note that, and we can move forward.
Absolutely. So without further ado, let me introduce our panelists. Today we are joined by Sarah Copeland Hanses, who is actually right near Lake Maury right now, probably the closest of any of us, but calling from her home office. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us. Sarah is the chair of House Government Operations and the co-chair with Chris of the Climate Solutions Caucus. So thanks to Sarah. We've also got Senator Chris Pearson, who is current co-chair and also co-founder of the Climate Solutions Caucus. So he really helped get this thing started many years ago. Is also the vice chair of Senate Agriculture and a member of Senate Finance. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
And last but not least, we've got Lauren Oates, who is the Climate and Energy Policy Manager at the Nature Conservancy's Vermont chapter, and formerly a State Hazard Mitigation Officer. She's also a member of the newly formed Climate Council that came out of the Global Warming Solutions Act. She'll be sharing a lot more about that process. And she is the member of that that was appointed because of her expertise in climate resilience, both at the Nature Conservancy and formerly at the state. So thank you so much for joining us, Lauren.
Thanks, Ben.
So I'll just say a couple of words, and I'm going to turn it over to Chris to get us started. Obviously, we're coming out of a year where the whole idea of sort of hope for the best and prepare for the worst was tested to its limits. No one was going into 2020 expecting to have to navigate a pandemic in their personal lives, and certainly not in the Vermont legislature. So we all came into 2020 with some bold plans for climate action, and actually quite a lot got done. I'm not going to spoil any surprises. I'll let Chris and Sarah talk about that. But I will say that I was very heartened to see how much could get done despite everything. I think that is a real testament to this community, VECAN and people in Vermont more generally who care about climate action. And going into 2021, because of the Global Warming Solutions Act, we have some real incredible opportunities in front of us. We hope to accomplish quite a lot in the legislature in 2021, though there are some challenges that we'll talk about to that. And then, of course, we've got the Climate Council that I mentioned a moment ago. That is going to be, it has, and in fact already has started working in earnest, putting together the blueprints for climate action plan for Vermont going beyond 2021. So to get us started, Chris, I want to ask you to give a bit of a recap on how we got here. Not just this last session, but a little bit before that. How did we end up having as much success as we did, and just remind folks a little bit about what has happened over the past 12, 18 months on climate here in Vermont. And as I'm asking Chris to get started, I'll also just ask if folks can drop in the chat who, if you were here for Saturday's session. I know we obviously covered some of this ground already. It's just going to be helpful for the panelists to see kind of what experience folks are coming into with this. So, though, of course, we're going to try to cover a lot of ground because we know not every single person here today was able to join on Saturday. But Chris, go for it. How did we get here?
Sure. Well, how long do we have? I'd say quickly, the Climate Solutions Caucus was something that I was proud to co-found, as you mentioned, with Margaret Cheney, then representative. And I think she and I then at that point served in the House. I'd look around that big red room, and it was always evident to me that actually a majority of us were concerned about climate change, accepted its existence, and yet we weren't really doing very much. And so it was a hope to collect people together to try to work on solutions and to elevate the risk and the need for action. And also, because it's a caucus as opposed to, say, a legislative committee where most of the work in Montpelier happens, it allows us appropriately, I think, to acknowledge that climate really impacts all variations of life, whether it's education, tax policy, agriculture. It doesn't fit neatly, nor should it, into one committee. So that was some of the goal as we got started. I'm proud to tell you now that we are the largest caucus in Montpelier, I think well into the 80s for our membership between the House and Senate. It's a nonpartisan group, and we try hard to get organized and advance climate solutions. So should I just dive into last year a little bit so people lay the groundwork a little bit, Ben?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. One of the great challenges when we think about the climate emergency is the timeline that scientists tell us we have to radically reshape our economy and our dependence on fossil fuels. And at the same time, fit that work into the legislature, which is dealing with any number of very significant challenges, and basically works for typically 4.5 months of the year. That is a big challenge, to say the least. I think if we worked 12 months a year, first of all, I wouldn't be there, but we still would struggle to meaningfully address this very, very real crisis. So about a year ago, a little over a year ago, Sarah and I started talking about how are we going to do this? How are we going to harness the grassroots energy that's out there, organize the legislature around some priorities, kind of digest what is the most meaningful steps we can take that are realistic. And our mantra was, significant but realistic. In other words, not introduce bills that are the right thing that aren't going to go anywhere, but put legislation on the governor's desk and get it into law. And that was our challenge. We set up a bunch of working groups. We worked throughout last summer and fall. And then, and this is something I'm really proud of, and many of you, I think, were probably a part of it, we went out to the communities. And one of the challenges, and one of the reasons I'm particularly proud of that work, is we have an intense grassroots energy out there from the Youth Congress on up into all across the age spectrum, the political spectrum, the economic spectrum in Vermont. But we're not all pulling for one thing. I mean, if you surveyed 10 people that were interested in climate, they would probably give you 15 different answers. And the legislature is only going to succeed when the grassroots is egging us on and pushing us forward. And how do you focus the grassroots? And so it was our attempt to sort of say, here are some bills that we think are significant and realistic, and see if we couldn't harness and kind of capture some of that grassroots power that really makes an enormous difference on Montpelier. And I'm very proud to tell you that even in the COVID universe, we had laid enough groundwork, and all of you spoke up at key moments, and you were engaged, and it really worked. So we set out with 4 or 5 high-level priorities, and then reams of little snippets that we added here and there into legislation. And of the 4 main topics that we promoted, I think 3 of them became law. And that's no small feat at any session. And during the COVID emergency, obviously the pandemic shut our session down. We went remote midway through. So feeling pretty significant about that. Probably the highest profile victory was getting what's called the Global Warming Solutions Act into law. This is foundational. It doesn't change our emission reduction overnight, but it is a planning document. It is a planning process, I should say. It sets up expertise from all segments of the economy to come forward and help create a roadmap. And it also sets emission reduction goals. As people probably know, Vermont lags New England in our emission reduction, and we lead New England in our per capita emission output. So we have some real work to do. The goals start out by aiming for the Paris reduction targets by the middle of the next decade, and then moves on to a net zero by 2050, joining New York and Maine and Massachusetts and others that are looking at the same thing. So that's kind of where some of why we got to this point. The other bills were to begin to invite Efficiency Vermont, our efficiency utility, to look at not just electricity, but all fuels, and setting up a process that gets their expertise helping us with emission reductions from fossil fuel burning, and also to help our professionals who are licensed by the state. Think of plumbers, electricians are obvious, but also real estate appraisers, realtors. They all have a role to play, and in fact, these professionals are dealing with thousands of Vermonters every day, helping us navigate what is likely our largest personal investment, our home, which is a big energy user. And so setting up a combination between that licensing process and some basic education, and trying to make sure these professionals are pulling in the same direction, helping Vermonters understand the programs that are out there and make decisions for the future, sustainable decisions that strengthen our economy, and go from there. So I think that covers it, Ben. I'll kick it back to you. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, you mentioned early in what you were saying about trying to bite off big but doable goals. I think about that as sort of, we're always trying to push the envelope as far as we can without it falling off the table. And I think the Climate Solutions Caucus did a really good job of that this past year, and we would have seen even more success, but for the pandemic. So it was really impressive to see the immense amount of work that the Climate Solutions Caucus did over last fall, following on the climate strike, in that sort of roadshow, and then really having seen that bear fruit over the last 12 months was amazing. So Sarah, now that Chris has sort of told us what happened in the last 12 months, use your crystal ball and tell us what's going to happen in the next 12. It really, I think, would be helpful for folks to have a sense of both, what are the sort of things that are being looked at, and what's the process going forward, where is the Climate Solutions Caucus at, and also just an understanding of what hasn't been decided yet, because obviously it is still a very weird year. We're starting everything very late. I know I've been feeling that, in my own home office here at VPIRG, and I know that's something that the Climate Solutions Caucus has been as well. And of course, just so folks know, Sarah, I'm sure will be touching on the Climate Council and the Solutions Act and sort of how that interacts with the legislative process. But of course, Lauren is going to be getting more into that in a few minutes. So Sarah, take it away.
Thanks, Ben. And thanks, Chris, for talking a little bit about the process that we went through last year to tee up our priorities from last year. I just have to say that the membership of VECAN have been very critical in terms of helping us to get our word out, and also holding the legislature accountable for making progress on our climate goals. And so we appreciate you very much, and definitely will need to tap on you to help us move policies in the future. So a little bit about where we are. I think we have gained probably about a dozen new members of the Climate Solutions Caucus, newly elected folks who will be sworn in January. And we haven't done a final tally, but Chris is right. We're definitely in the mid 80s and possibly higher, given that the folks who retired were not necessarily members of the Climate Solutions Caucus, so much as the new members are clamoring to get in. So we've had a couple of conversations with folks who are in the Climate Solutions Caucus about what our priorities are for this year, and I just need to say that we're tempering our eagerness to move forward and meet our climate goals with the reality that in a remote meeting environment like we're heading into in January, it is going to be much harder to have a big agenda, because it takes a lot longer for bills to make their way through the process in this remote meeting format. And so I would expect that this year's priorities will fall into the categories of saving Vermonters in their energy costs and working on resilience investments. And so saving money on energy, the no-brainer places where we can do that are by investing in weatherization. So we're going to continue to talk about ways to help more Vermont homes and buildings get weatherized, which gives you sort of a triple win in that it creates jobs and keeps money flowing in our local communities by employing folks in the weatherization trades to do that work. It immediately saves the family or the business money in their energy costs. And of course, it helps us to meet our overall goal of reducing emissions here in Vermont. But those triple win scenarios are really what we're going to be looking for. We're going to be looking for places where we're saving money as well as creating revenue for the state and revenue for our local businesses. In the resiliency category, there's been a lot of local resilience organizations cropping up to support their neighbors during COVID, mainly around food access and supporting folks who need to maintain stricter social distancing to prevent spread of the virus. But a lot of these resiliency organizations are ones that tap on lessons we learned after Tropical Storm Irene, and so we definitely want to make sure that we're supporting those local organizations who are helping their neighbors. In the realm of resiliency, though, we also need to look at water quality, and I think the exciting alignment is this growing body of knowledge that our healthy soils and our healthy forests are actually good for water quality, and they're good for sequestering carbon, which is going to be critical going forward. And so we're going to continue our look at how we how we foster healthy soils and promote the kind of sequestration that we need to see. And then the other sort of broad category that we'll be looking at this year for the Legislative Climate Solutions Caucus is really around what does federal stimulus COVID relief money look like coming into the state, and where could we use that to again save Vermonters money on their energy costs. And so we will be deploying eyes and ears in every committee room in the State House in order to look for opportunities to align our COVID relief with money saving and emissions saving. So not a lot of specifics at this moment, but we are committed to continuing to work as a group, as a growing group, and we're very happy to have the support and the grassroots networking of these VECAN members. So I appreciate you all being here and working within your communities to help move forward with climate legislation. The Climate Solutions Caucus is very interested in keeping a close track of what's going on in the Climate Council. We appreciate that the council has a big workload ahead of them, and they're going to need the all of the time that they have in front of them in order to make some recommendations for us. But we'll keep in close contact with them, and I know that Lauren's going to talk a bit more about some of the early indicators of what the Climate Council is going to work on.
Thanks so much, Sarah. So let's just shift gears, and I'll turn it over to Lauren in a second. Let me just remind folks, please do put your questions in the chat. I know sometimes when I'm on calls like these, I tend to just focus on the video and not really think about the chat. So I wanted to highlight that verbally because Joey and I also mentioned it there. And then just to be clear, there's no reason to wait. You can just put it in there right now, and that'll allow Joey and I to get that into sort of Q&A queue before we actually start the formal Q&A. Wow, that was a mouthful. Lauren, please go ahead. So again, as I mentioned, Lauren is on the actual Climate Council. She also is one of the advocates who was really instrumental in the whole process throughout the legislative session around the Global Warming Solutions Act, really followed it every step of the way. So is an expert in many different ways around that. So maybe a little bit of sort of like how we got here, just like how it's set up, that folks are appointed, but then obviously, of course, really what folks are interested in is hearing like what might actually happen over the next 12 months around this.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks, Senator Pearson and Copeland Hanses for giving that good context for me. You gave me like an easy layup here. I'll say, Ben, thanks for asking the participants whether or not they attended on Saturday for the Solutions Act overview. I do have a few slides, maybe just, if nothing else, to give you all a break from looking at our faces and a few pretty pictures. I'll be brief though, because I know it's going to be pretty redundant for several of you, and Senator Pearson just went over some of it too. But before I jump into the actual council, I want to give you the context of where it came from. So I'm going to try to share my screen, and Ben, I'm looking to you to give me a thumbs up if I get it right on this new platform. Can you see it? Okay, I see a thumbs up. Great. All right, the Global Warming Solutions Act, Senator Pearson and Ben both mentioned, and if any of you attended on Saturday, Jen Duggan from Conservation Law Foundation noted that this has been a multi-year effort that came to the session in 2020, and we were very fortunate that in spite of COVID, or even alongside of COVID, we had some really strong members, especially in the Climate Solutions Caucus, who were willing and able to push this forward, recognizing that the climate crisis is here and there is a lot of work that needs to be done. So a quick overview of that. Let's see if it'll pass. There we go. What we know is that our goals aren't working. As Senator Pearson said, Vermont is the only state in the region, and the region is all 6 New England states, the province of Quebec and the state of New York to actually increase our emissions from our 2005 levels. So even though we have a smaller footprint, perhaps, we actually have the most work to be done to get on the right track. This is from the 2019 EAN report, which I highly recommend you look at. It's got a lot of digestible information and data for opportunities ahead. The Global Warming Solutions Act, in an attempt to recognize that those goals are not working over the past 15 years, changes those goals into requirements. Senator Pearson already mentioned these, but I'll just remind you all that we have 3 significant targets that we must now meet. By 2025, which is only 4 years from now, believe it or not, we need to reduce our emissions by 25% of our 2005 levels. By 2030, in 9 years, we need to get 40% below our 1990 levels. And then by 2050, we need to be at least 80% below our 1990 levels. These are pretty significant efforts, but it's important to note that we are not first in our region to do this. Massachusetts has had a Global Warming Solutions Act in place for more than a decade. We're following states like Connecticut, Maine, and New York and getting these stood up. So we have a lot of work, not only done in state, which I'll touch on a little bit, but in our neighboring states in the region to get this work done too. So we're not really being a leader here, but we can be in how we decide to stand up our council, those subcommittees, and our climate action plan. So the Global Warming Solutions Act stands up a 23-member council. It has representation from a whole bunch of sectors. Unfortunately, 23 members is obviously not enough to touch down on every single place that climate will, but we've got representation from the administration, we have representation from the youth lobby, we have representation from the environmental sector, farms and forest, utilities, and a handful of others. And so we're really looking forward to, as a group, committing to developing this climate action plan that's required to be submitted and adopted by the end of next year. So we've got 12 months, believe it or not, to figure out a plan that's going to address not only these emissions reductions requirements now, but also climate adaptation and resilience. And I think that, and I might just be biased since I'm sitting on the council as a resilient seat, but I'm really thrilled that our legislature considered the importance of climate adaptation and resilience, recognizing that climate change impacts are already here. And we need to not only do our mitigation work in emissions, which is what I largely consider avoiding the unmanageable, but also understanding what we have to do to manage the unavoidable, which is what's already here and what's to come in the decades ahead. And the good news, I know when we talk climate change, it can get really, really depressing and challenging and very existential. But the good news is we do know how to solve climate change. And I usually put these in 3 buckets in my mind that might be helpful for you all too. First, we need to reduce our emissions. We talked about those emissions reductions requirements a moment ago. We need to remove the emissions that are already out there, and we can do this pretty significantly actually in the New England and Vermont landscape by leveraging our natural and working lands to sequester and store carbon. And we also need to adapt to the emissions. So adapt to what's already changing on the ground. And here's an image that I'm sure many of you have seen. There are many, many more like it. This is from Irene, but as you all may or may not be aware, in the last decade, we've actually experienced a 3-fold increase in federally declared disasters from the decade before. So that's why, again, I'll say resilience is incredibly important. I consider it the umbrella under which all climate work needs to be done, but we need to consider the resilience of both our natural systems that support our communities and our communities as well. And that ranges from protecting forests to understanding our opportunities in the financial sector for supporting a green economy. And then last, before I jump into the council itself, is just getting to work. The legislature is about to kick off in a few short weeks here. The Climate Council has already begun meeting. And I think this photo really encapsulates the work that I've been focused on for the past several years. I realize I have a photo actually next to this high water mark. This is in South Royalton, but the photo of me is quite blurry, so I'm going to share this, which is quite unfortunate because you can't get the scale. I'm hoping, Ben, once again, I'm looking for you. Can you see my cursor in this image? It's in the sky. It's over the Irene. Can you see it? A bit?
I don't see a cursor. Maybe other people see it. Oh, yeah, right where the E.
Well,
Look, folks, look at the E. I didn't see it.
All right. If you can see it now on the post, right now on the post, that's actually where I stand, and I'm 5'5". To give you a scale, because I can see how this looks like maybe it's a 2-foot post. No, that's like an 11-foot post. So just to give you an idea of the work that's ahead, Irene was, as many of my former colleagues in the emergency management realm would say, was the trailer, not the movie. So we have a lot that we need to anticipate and expect and plan for. And that is the role of the council. I've stopped sharing screens. We're a little bit bigger. Looks like we're good here. So the council, as I said, it's 23 members. There are going to be 4 subcommittees. And I'm hoping, because this is a public endeavor, that many of you on here, all 33 perhaps, will be interested in participating in these public meetings. Though COVID has required us all to be working from our home offices, as you see us all here, it actually does afford some opportunities for public input where they might not have otherwise been. So our first meeting was a week and a half ago. It was largely just an introductory meeting to the council members, and also being part of a public forum and records retention. So if you attended that meeting, it might have been a little dull. I'm hoping that obviously in the coming weeks, we'll have a few more meetings. Our next one is actually December 21st at 8 a.m. There's a Climate Council website that I can drop into the chat when I'm done talking, or maybe Ben or Joey can now. So you can all see those agendas as they come up, links to joining them. They're on Microsoft Teams, and recognizing that at the end of each of the, thanks Joey, at the end of each of those meetings, there is time for public comment. So that's, I think, a really critical lens that all of you can, a platform rather, that you all can join and have your good thoughts heard. I do want to really highlight too, as one of the 23 council members, I actually think those subcommittees are incredibly important. And the council has not yet determined how we're going to stand those subcommittees up, or what the complexion of those subcommittees are going to be. But assuming it's going to be very public, and we want as many good people on there as possible, representing their sectors, their interests, making sure this is a really robust, comprehensive plan that has engaged as many Vermonters as possible. I really think those subcommittees who are going to be developing recommended actions for the committee the council rather to review, I would just say keep your eye on that. Hope that we can all keep you updated on what's going on there. That website that's it's a little pithy right now. We'll have more information as we learn more. As I said, we've only had one meeting, and it was largely introductory. So more information will be available as we move forward. Good ideas for the council. We have state email addresses now. I would just recommend reaching out to us as often as you'd like, attending the meetings as you can, and recognizing that there's really opportunity, especially with those subcommittees as we try to stand them up. And I think I already mentioned this, but the next meeting is December 21st. And I think that's it. I think we have lots of time for questions and answers. So hopefully the 3 of us can engage you that way.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I'll also just mention on the public input, there will actually be sort of formal opportunities for public input in addition to those individual meetings. That isn't something that the council has sort of figured out yet. So as the council does figure it out, certainly our hope at VPIRG, I know, VNRC and other organizations as well, is that those will be sort of early and often. And we will be letting you all know when those sort of formal opportunities are. If you aren't already on the VNRC list, the VPIRG list, please sign up, and we will be in touch about that. Before I ask a few sort of more open-ended questions of any of you, any of the panelists who are interested in weighing in about sort of the challenges we're facing, how a virtual session is a little bit different, I did want to actually double back and ask one more question about this coming legislative session. And then obviously there'll be a few more from the audience in the Q&A. But Chris, I know you've been following sort of how the evolution of how Climate Solutions Caucus members are starting to think about transportation. I would love to hear a little bit from you, and I'm sure other folks are interested, since that's about 45% of Vermont's climate pollution. Obviously, it's a big area that we've got to address. Maybe some bigger things will be coming in the future, as the council gets their work underway. But what can folks expect based on what you know now, which I know is early days, about the coming session on transportation?
It's a great question, Ben. And so, yes, it is the single largest source of our emissions, and a particular challenge in a rural state where a lot of working folks have to drive a long way to get to work. And so I'm not here to tell you we've got one solution coming, will be done by February. But some promising development in the last few years. We've been making key investments, whether it's in electric charging infrastructure, some rebate programs for people buying electric cars, but also programs to get people, particularly Vermonters with a lower income, into more efficient cars, right? We don't need to go all the way to an electric car if we're improving somebody's mileage standard by 20 miles an hour. That 20 miles per gallon, then we're moving in the right direction. We've set up some of those programs. What I'm excited to watch play out is the chair of House Transportation, Kurt McCormick, my neighbor here in Burlington, has requested of the Agency of Transportation that they outline a climate section in their budget, and that may not sound like a big deal. It has yet to see how it plays out. But the point is to orient the thinking. I mean, the agency typically is thinking about pavement. What roads are we repairing? What bridges are we repairing? You know, what median strips are we mowing? Those kinds of very sort of basic things we've been doing for decades. And asking them and changing some of the culture so that there's an emphasis on emission reduction, on saving Vermonters money and their transportation needs, is a very, very important step, and I'm excited for that call. So that remains to be seen, but the T-bill is a bill that passes every year, and it outlines our transportation budget, and this year hopefully will increase the trend. You know, even investments in park and rides. We don't think of this as earth-shattering, but every park and ride we build, basically anyone that's using it cuts their emissions in half that day if they're carpooling. Now, we can't carpool maybe during COVID, but you know, I drive by on my way to Montpelier, the Richmond Park and Ride, that's been expanded over several years. And the minute the construction's done, the expansion's filled. So Vermonters are looking for ways to save money and carpool to work, right? And we got to make that easy. It's an example of an investment that quickly returns dividends. The other thing is the so-called Transportation Climate Initiative, TCI. If people aren't familiar, this is an interesting discussion. It's been underway for many years among the 12 most northeastern, maybe even 13, 14 northeastern states, from Maine over to New York, all the way down through DC and into Virginia. These states together collectively represent about a third of the country's economy, almost that much. And the goal is to work together to reduce transportation emissions, recognizing this is a regional challenge and potentially coming up with a regional approach, much like we've actually done around energy production. So-called RGGI has successfully kept electric rates low and taken coal plants offline and had a much greater investment in renewable energy regionally. It's something that most of us don't see or feel, but has been operating since Jim Douglas entered Vermont into RGGI, what is that, 12, 13 years ago. Similar approach for transportation. That, I think next week, mid-December, we're going to see an MOU come out from all of the states. That's a bit of a wait and see what that MOU is, what the details mean. But there's a real promise there to be able to make strategic investments, help Vermonters save money on getting to work and getting around the state. So that's a little piece of the transportation thing. As with the priorities Sarah mentioned, this is evolving quickly, and actually will evolve into session, I expect, because of the nature of trying to work during a pandemic.
Thanks so much, Chris. So I've got one, maybe two more questions for you, and then we're going to do the Q&A from the audience. Thank you, everyone, for sharing questions. There are now a lot of them, and we'll see how many we can get to. So that's a great problem to have. So the next, maybe the last question I wanted to ask You all, especially Chris and Sarah, but Joey, Lauren, if you have thoughts on this as well, certainly would be very interested in hearing them. Can you share your thoughts on how it has changed in this sort of COVID era? How can people continue to influence the legislative process with the State House physically unavailable? You know, we often will urge people to come and visit their legislators in person. That's obviously not in the mix right now. Large rallies are off the table largely. So a lot of the tactics we think about in the public sphere are not part of the mix. And then let me just read a question from Jeff Forward that's sort of in the same vein. How important are calls and personal emails from constituents in moving legislators on specific issues? And then also, do you think the governor can be moved by those kinds of contacts? So Chris or Sarah, thoughts on that?
So yeah, I will jump in and just say that while COVID doesn't allow us to have in-person rallies, as you mentioned, we're all gaining a whole lot of skills on how to meet over all sorts of different formats, whether it's this hop-in conference format or a Zoom. And so I think that there are a lot of opportunities out there for us to, in real time, us as in legislators in real time, to be able to have these check-in meetings with folks who are passionate about moving these policies. You know, last year, as Chris mentioned, we had a series of roadshow events where either Chris or I, you know, went to many different communities around the state, and the logistics of that was pretty daunting. But if we can expect that folks are now accustomed to meeting virtually, I would expect that we could have a lot more of these you know, check-ins with Vermonters about our climate policy priorities, and do it, you know, more throughout the legislative session, and instead of having to do in-person meetings, which are very time-consuming. So yes, the question about whether legislators are swayed by calls and emails from their constituents, yes, absolutely. It's very important to stay in touch with your legislator, particularly around these climate issues. I would welcome Chris to jump in if he's got a thought on how receptive the governor is to those kinds of questions, calls, and emails. I don't know. I mean, what we observe about the governor is that he seems to understand that climate change is a problem. And he seems to understand that the U.S. Climate Alliance and the Paris Climate Accords was very important for the United States in making a shift to lowering our carbon emissions and using different forms of electricity than fossil fuel. It's hard to perceive how he's seeing his role as governor in supporting those efforts, given that he vetoed the Global Warming Solutions Act and continues to signal his uncertainty of whether he believes that it is, you know, to put our emissions reductions goals in statute and create a council whose task it is to help us develop a plan. I will jump on one of the other questions that I saw in the chat, though, before I let Chris talk for a moment if he's got thoughts on this. But the Attorney General's opinion absolutely does matter. The AG's office was engaged as we developed this legislation. They were engaged with the committee process as both the House and Senate were deliberating the Global Warming Solutions Act. And it's nice to see that Attorney General Donovan reiterated that he believes that the Global Warming Solutions Act is constitutional, and that the Climate Council has now the statutory directive to help create a plan. So, so we do appreciate that. And Chris, any other thoughts on?
Yeah. And you know, just on the Global Warming Solutions Act, there is sometimes, I heard it throughout the campaign, and this mythology that in that law we handed away, we abdicated our power and our responsibility as the legislature, and nothing could be further from the truth. We actually do this kind of thing across the board in state government, and what we did was we handed them an assignment, a plan. Come up with a plan. Tell us what we could do. We didn't give them spending authority. We didn't give them taxing authority. We didn't give them power beyond making a plan. The plan then comes to the legislature or comes to the administration to tweak, to adapt, to make it into law. But we're not powerless to then take whatever they say and drive it into law like verbatim. So it's very strange. We do all sorts of planning like this, seeking outside input and expertise from across the board. And that's what the Global Warming Solutions Act, the Climate Council, does. Directly to Jeff's question, yes, emails work. They have real impact, particularly organic emails that people craft themselves, but even the form letters that others help you generate matter. And you know, the legislature has 0 staff. Like when you email me, it comes to my phone or my computer. And so I see those, and I particularly see when there's any volume. In terms of moving the governor, he does have staff, and I can tell you that they are clearly counting emails. So if he gets 10 emails on a topic, they'll note that. If he gets 2,000 emails on a topic, they will note that. Same with phone calls. And so it is very important to not forget about the governor. And I would just say, when Sarah and I met with the governor about a year ago to talk about some of the priorities, and we had been all around the state at this point having these public meetings. And it was amazing trying to say, in particular to young people who are very, very worried about climate, you know, here's what we think is realistic to get to the governor's desk in the next 4 months in session. And they would rightly critique us and say, this is much too timid. You know, the science is demanding X, Y, and Z. And you know, being yelled at by 8th graders has a real impact on you. I have elementary school kids, and, you know, I pay attention to that. But it's our job to navigate really as far as we think the legislature can go on these topics. And so we sort of brought it up to the governor. People everywhere is very concerned about this, and we're hearing about it every day. And people are worried about our economy in a you know, transitioning. And he basically said, "Boy, I don't ever hear about this concern." And then he corrected himself and said, "Well, other than when I'm visiting high schools." So if you're above the age of high school, please make your voice heard to the governor. And our business leaders who are allies in crafting a sustainable economy, we need you to weigh in with the governor. Absolutely, he is responsive to public pressure and to public voices, as the legislature are. And just one final piece on this. For the legislature, I represent Chittenden County in the Senate. I have 130,000 constituents. It's a very large district. If I get 15 emails on one topic, I notice that. So if a House member who represents about 4,000 or 8,000 people gets 2, 3, 4, 5 emails, that is significant. So please know that your voice really counts and has a very direct ability to influence votes and the direction of the legislature.
Thank you both so much. That was really helpful. It's always a good reminder, and I think in particular right now, a good reminder that despite the world being totally upside down in many ways, those basic, you know, fundamental things still remain true. So let me make one quick note. For folks who are not looking in the chat, there are some good questions in there. We'll try to get to as many as we can. As I mentioned, there are also a number of links that various folks, Joey put a couple in there. I dropped one in about Mileage Smart, which Chris mentioned. Bob Farnham has added links to a number of sort of hubs on his website where there are good resources for over the past year from the Climate Solutions Caucus and others. So do check those out, click them, so they're in a tab on your computer and you have them when the session's done. Let me ask sort of a couple of questions here that are related. They're relatively long, so I'm not going to read them verbatim, but basically a couple of folks are pointing out that the solar industry has lost a lot of jobs of late. Even pre-pandemic, that was true. And the Clean Energy Development Fund, which is one thing that right now isn't supporting solar, but has historically, is running out of money. And then another comment about how we sort of account for renewable energy here in Vermont isn't really in line with other standards, and most of the stuff that we're calling green in the renewable electricity space is not actually new renewable energy. Our policies aren't getting a lot of new renewables built. So Chris, I know this is something you worked a lot on over the past year. We saw a bill that would not, sort of wholesale fix that, but get some more new renewables built, move part of the way through the Senate and then stall out with the pandemic. Can you speak just a little bit to like how legislators are continuing to think about that going forward?
I can try. Yeah, our bill was to move our grid to 100% renewables by 2030, if I'm not mistaken, and also beef up local small-scale production. And we did actually get past one committee, which was a tricky lift, but then the pandemic sent us home, and it fell to the wayside. I think, what I like as I see the question come in is this idea of renewable energy credits and how we're accounting for energy in Vermont and whether or not it's green. We clearly need to make a fix, because right now Vermont energy utilities can buy RECs, so-called credits for a renewable source from Quebec, from Hydro-Quebec, for $1 a kilowatt hour or something like that. They don't even have to be attached to the power. And then they can say we're dealing in renewable energy. In fact, those are cheap RECs because nobody else wants them. Literally, they can't be sold anywhere else because nobody else honors this idea that old, large hydro is what we want for the future of energy production. There's a methane release. There's a whole host of issues going with such a large hydro production. And certainly giving utilities credit for green energy from not even using the energy, but just the paper fiction of a so-called REC is a real problem. And a lot of us are looking at that and wondering if we can build a coalition to get that change. It's modest, but it would be significant in our energy development. In terms of solar in state, there has been a diminishment, a reduction of solar jobs. That's a shame. The investments we make in solar energy in state not only are jobs at the moment, but then of course those generating power in state, as opposed to shipping all of our money to coast of Massachusetts, have offshore wind maybe, or to Quebec. You keep that money in the economy. That's a really smart strategy. We have seen that curtailed. Some curtailment is inevitable because we really exploded, and the whole sort of renewable energy and solar installation took off much faster than maybe people imagined. So it's not surprising that it's curtailed a little bit, but we need to hit that sweet spot, and we want to have this being a robust part of our local economy. That power money, the energy generation stays here. It's part of a resilient grid. It's part of a small grid. When you add storage to that, it's a really smart solution for our small communities. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, one of the reasons I think we've done pretty well in the COVID universe, notwithstanding the current numbers, is that we have been able to turn to our small communities and to take care of one another, and maybe not go so far when we're picking up groceries. And so we're not sprinkled around very much. We're able to stay in a smaller sphere. And that has been part of our success. And we're looking after one another. That's been part of our success. Those are the same dynamics that will treat us well and give us a real shot at a strong economy in a far less dependent on fossil fuel future. So there are a lot of lessons out of the pandemic that I think apply to the climate crisis and that give me some hope, actually. But anyway, that's more than you asked for, but there you go.
Thanks, Chris. I'll also just add that renewable electricity is certainly something I hope that the Climate Council is going to be taking up as well. Obviously, they have their work cut out for them to put together a plan on weatherization and the sort of thermal heating sector and transportation. But as the question askers and Chris, Senator Pearson commented, we're obviously not done in the renewable electric space as well. So there's definitely some work to be done, not just in the legislature, but in the council as well. I want to shift now to another question. Sarah, or I guess either of you, please do chime in on this one. Andrea is asking, job growth opportunities are limited by workforce and labor pool. Will the Climate Caucus work reach down into education, including jobs in the trades?
So that is a great question, and I got really excited when I saw that come through, because it was reminding me of conversations that we've been having as a Climate Solutions Caucus about how to make climate action something that every committee in the legislature is concerned with. And this linkage between workforce development and our in-state educational institutions gives us a really important opportunity that we need to consider, which is how do we grow the workforce that we need to achieve some of these goals. Workforce development in the trades around weatherization is one aspect of it, but solar installation training. If you think about the key link between broadband, high-speed internet availability statewide and our ability to meet our climate goals. All of these are places where I can imagine our state college system, for instance, stepping in to offer programs that help develop the workforce for the future. I could also see our regional technical centers getting involved in this as well. And I think the key to making that happen doesn't necessarily fall solely to the legislature. There are small levers that we can pull that can help make that happen. But it's always most impactful if it's a combination of the educational institution, the employers, and the legislature sort of all working together to move in that direction. So it's definitely something that we are keeping an eye on, and it is something that we are focused on supporting as we encourage all of our committees in the legislature to be looking at ways they can join in the fight.
Thanks, Sarah. Let me go back up here to a couple of questions that were asked earlier. So Chad asks, in addition to weatherization, supporting climate action and safe, affordable housing, et cetera, are there cross-sector or committee efforts that fit within the stated frame of all efforts working towards common ends? For example, agriculture and local or regional food procurement. Chris, is this one you want to take?
Sure, glad to. Yes, there is an work, and we were given, as I hope people know, so-called CARES money. This was about a $1.25 billion from the federal government, soon after the pandemic began, and there were all sorts of strings attached, including you had to spend all of the money and have whatever you were buying in place by a few weeks from now, which is not a lot of time. But as an example, and this relates to the question, we were able to make an investment in restaurants who had to promise to buy X% from local farmers to make food to deliver meals to people who were experiencing food insecurity. So in that example, and I'm proud of it, and I wish we'd done more of it, but we helped local farmers, we helped the restaurant business, and we got food to people who are experiencing food insecurity. And as we all know, that's a big, those numbers are climbing and rather scary. I think we should commit to making sure our neighbors do not go hungry. There are, in ag is a great example of, you know, a desire to have good jobs here. We have people who are dying to buy local produce. We have people who are dying to get onto land to farm. We have people who are trying to figure out how to transition off of the dairy farm or retire from the dairy farm. And so so there's a lot of confluence here, and there's a lot of good work going into connecting the pieces of that puzzle, but we certainly haven't nailed it. It is a work in progress. And I would just say, somebody at the, I think Lauren mentioned healthy soils. You know, this is another good example where we're trying to figure out if there can be some acknowledgement that regenerative ag practices builds healthy soils, and could the public sort of be engaged in rewarding farmers for that. Right now, we primarily reward farmers for one ecosystem service, which is producing milk. You know, what about others like sequestering carbon, building soil? Building soil, by the way, also helps with our water runoff problem. So there's a ton of sympathetic and kind of in sync potential here. Nobody has quite figured this out, but if Vermont can lead the way, and there is a lot of good work happening already, including directly from farmers that are at the table trying to figure this out with us, if we can lead the way, not only will that help us and strengthen our economy and our rural economy, but it will reduce emissions here in Vermont, and it will provide some solutions, I think, for a great deal of our rural partners across the country, that we're not alone in trying to figure this out. But I do think our scale maybe lends itself to us figuring out some of the solutions. And you know, UVM Ag Extension, it's important to shout them out. They are doing some great work on this. There are a lot of partners working hard, and I hope that the legislature will kind of re-emphasize this and make some investments. And I'll give you just a little example. We were trying to figure out if we could stimulate schools to buy more local produce. And New York, Michigan, a few other states have said to schools, if you buy 20%, I think, of your food locally, and there's definitions for that, then we'll give you 20 cents per meal. And now in the school food world, 20 cents a meal is a lot of money. I think they get in total about $1.40. And it immediately returns to the local economy, right, and helps our local farmers. So this is an example of something we were working very hard on, actually, and got shut down by the pandemic. The federal government makes that about as hard as possible because they have a lot to do with food in our schools. But it's an example of some of the synergistic opportunity that we're doing that is really about the economy, but also incidentally has a strong climate benefit.
Thanks, Chris. And I think you tackled one or two more questions as you were going. There was another one about agriculture that I think you touched on pretty well. Though, as everyone knows, none of these are, all of these things are things that you could have day-long seminars on or study for years. So we're keeping it pretty surface level to try to get through more topics. One question from Sam. I feel like there was some legislation on this, and I'm forgetting the details. So if one of you remembers, it would be great if you could share. To move forward towards the social framing, we need to push climate action further. Has legislation for climate change education been considered? K-12, similar to what's done in Massachusetts, but also general public orientations for industries, et cetera. Obviously, you touched on what had been done around employees that need to be certified by the state in their various professions. I recall there was a bill around K-12 education and climate. Do you know where that stands at this point?
I'm not sure that I know where the bill stands at this point. I hear this idea coming up frequently in our roadshow conversations with Vermonters a year ago, and it makes a whole lot of sense to make sure that we're educating the next generation of students, what climate science is all about, and help them with the foundational information they need to imagine some of the solutions of the future. Chris, I don't know if you saw any meaningful work being done on that legislation on your side. I don't believe that we did last year. But that's not to say that we wouldn't see a stronger push in the coming session.
Yeah, like you. I remember the bill. I remember the discussion, the idea, but I'm not aware. I'm not on those committees. I'm not aware of it advancing. Like a lot of areas of the state, there are many big issues around education and education funding and like that. So they tend to bump these good curriculum ideas out. But we'll keep trying, and please do advocate for it. So I think it's important.
Yeah.
So one just procedural question, Joey, if you're there, Bob is wondering if we're going to be saving the chat. I know the session itself is going to be recorded, which is obviously very helpful, but there's some good stuff in there as well. So we will try to grab that, even if it's just a copy paste. I'm not familiar with Hopin and whether that's something it is getting double thumbs up. Great. And to that point, I just want to be clear for folks who put comments in the chat. There's a lot of good stuff in there. I'm sure Chris and Sarah have been reading that feels a little bit more like suggestions that need to be considered by the legislature, but are maybe a little bit more, very particular details. So I'm not going to bring them to using my facilitator's prerogative, the large group. But there's a lot of really good stuff in there, including several items that I know are being discussed. One that is a little bit sort of more 30,000 foot, Thad asked, and this is, I think, probably going to be doubling back a little bit to something you've already talked about, but I would love your perspective on, are there easy ways to ask legislators to put in, little things within energy bills? Like if somebody has a sort of particular idea, where do they take that when it comes to the legislature and legislation?
Yeah, concrete, discrete ideas that relate to a particular policy area probably are best taken to a member of the Climate Caucus who happens to sit on whatever committee is moving a bill related to that. And so it can be a little bit challenging as a citizen to wade through the legislative website to figure out exactly who's a member of the Climate Caucus on a particular topic or on a particular committee. But once we have committee assignments in January, I'm sure that either Chris or I could help to point people in the right direction to find a climate person on a particular committee.
I'll also add that, obviously you can always reach out to your own legislators, depending on exactly what the idea is. That's sometimes a good place to start, and they can, be part of that conversation with somebody on the relevant committee. So a couple of good options there. Senator Pearson, do you want to, you just added something in the chat about, I think it was probably the Zoom roadshows, although Jeff had a few good questions there, so maybe it was something else. Do you want to just say a word about that?
Yeah, no, Jeff asked if we would do a virtual version of the roadshow, and we are trying to figure that out. We'd like to have a little more of a concrete agenda of our own to bring. Look for that January, maybe February, or maybe both. It's a great suggestion. Thanks.
Thanks. And I'll say again, just to reiterate, in addition to the Climate Solutions Caucus, of course, there's also going to be in it the Climate Council itself, hopefully doing something like that at some point coming up. Certainly, it's part of, there needs to be a public process as that plan is being crafted. That's part of the legislation. What exactly that looks like is still an open question, though. Again, as Lauren mentioned, because all of this is virtual, go to the website that Joey posted in the chat, and you can always jump on and listen to and even comment at the end of any of these Climate Council meetings. So we are just about at time. We have maybe time for one more question. Senator Pearson or Representative Copeland Hanses, was there anything in the chat that sort of rose to the top for you that you'd love to chime in on quickly before we wrap?
I saw one question come through or observation come through that I think is really important for the folks in this session to really ponder. And that was that it's difficult to create jobs in weatherization if we're not sure that those jobs are going to be there in the future, which means that we all need to be thinking about how do we create the most sustainable funding mechanism to help Vermonters weatherize their homes, whether it's a full grant to a very low income person, or whether it's just an easy to access loan or some form of on-bill financing for somebody who's maybe at the other end of the economic spectrum. Making sure that we get those financial levers pulling in the right direction is really important to creating a sustainable weatherization workforce.
Hear, hear. So we are at time. Thank you everyone for joining. This has been a real pleasure. And again, I'm really looking forward to seeing everyone in person this time next year down at Lake Maury. And thank you especially to Lauren and Senator Pearson and Representative Copeland Hanses. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this panel.